Hey everybody, my name is Reem Hajjar and I'm an associate professor in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. And I'm going to present the study that I did with all these co-authors looking at a global analysis of the social and environmental outcomes of community forests. And so this presentation is based on a paper that was published in Nature Sustainability in 2021, funded by the UK DFID through C4. So first, why do we need a systematic review on community forests? Well, we know that there is a substantial body of research, mostly based in case studies in various countries that has taken place throughout the decades. And these case studies have really demonstrated the successes and failures of community forests in different areas. And so what was missing was really this a need to compile all this information from these case studies in a global review of all that literature that has looked at these cases to be able to assess a more global picture of outcomes, and in particular looking at multidimensional sustainability outcomes, where we're looking at how well are they doing at securing rights of communities, how well are they at conserving forests, and how well are they at improving livelihoods of community members. And then with all this literature in one database where these studies synthesized, we could use that body of literature to explore, well, what factors have actually led to community forest success or an improved forest condition, livelihoods, etc. And so we set about doing a systematic review. We have the details of the methods are summarized in the systematic review protocol here. I won't get into all the different steps, but just to note that we started off with keyword searches and such in over 15,000 articles that we then whittled down according to our selection criteria to 267 articles. And those articles represented 697 individual cases of community forests around the world. This was a very carefully designed, exhaustive review of the literature. And from that literature, we extracted data from all those studies on 50 different factors or variables of interest, including these contextual factors, as well as outcome variables that were grouped eventually to three main categories. So forest condition or forest health, and then livelihoods being the income, household and community level incomes and employment, and rights, which was a summary variable of forest access for both commercial and subsistence purposes. And so we took out all this data, we had this big database, and we started to analyze that information. One thing to note, this is sort of where the cases were located in the world. So literature really had a very large focus on South Asia, where over half the cases came from India and Nepal, very strong representation in Tanzania, and in Latin America, very much dominated by Brazil and Mexico. And so immediately from this, you can see that we had an unbalanced data set, right? And the fact that over half the cases came from South Asia likely means that the literature, the body of literature, is not very representative of community forests worldwide. We know that there are many, many community forests in Latin America that aren't coming up in this search. So with that knowledge that our case study set is probably biased towards South Asia, I'm going to present some of the results that we found. So first, I'm going to talk about the co-occurrence of joint positive outcomes. So how often do we encounter different combinations of positive and negative environment, income, and rights outcomes? Remember, these are the three major outcomes that we're looking at. So first, let's see what the frequency of positive outcomes were. We found that over 56% of cases showed environmental improvements, over 68% of cases showed income improvements, and this is again at the community level here. But we also found that over half the cases saw declines in access and use rights. And so this is after a community forest project or intervention came to a community, over half those cases ended up losing some of their access rights, or different people in those communities losing a lot of their access rights. So this is kind of counterintuitive, given that community forestry is meant to be about providing local users with more rights and access to forests. So we were interested in seeing how often you'd get positive paired outcomes. So again, thinking about multidimensional sustainability here. So we looked at cases that had both positive environment and positive income outcomes, in cases where there seemed to be some sort of trade-off between environment and income, and the cases where there's sort of lose-lose cases where both factors decreased. We found a large portion here of 46% of cases had joint positive outcomes with both environment and income increasing. So we don't see large trade-offs here being reported between environments and incomes, which is somewhat counter to what some people expect. That you'd expect that protecting the forest would result in reduced incomes, but we found a fair amount of cases where this wasn't really the case. It is, of course, key to think about, well, who in the community is benefiting from the increased incomes, and several case authors described some amount of people benefiting from new income sources and others not benefiting. We also additionally looked at another metric, benefit sharing, which I'm not going to show a graph here for, but benefit sharing became less equitable post-community forestry in 50% of the reporting cases that reported that in our sample. Now let's look at income and rights. This one was more surprising at first, as you'd expect these two to be synergistic. We found, in fact, only 36% saw both increases in income and rights. 31% saw trade-offs. So one explanation is that having formalized rights here can lead to increased individual or community outcomes, even if it meant that formalization curtailed customary rights. But then there were several cases where a whole village might have customary rights curtailed, and forest-based income mostly just benefited the elites, right? While the poor and the marginalized really suffered from these forest use restrictions implemented as part of, let's say, formalizing a management plan. In other trade-off cases, we saw that individuals participating in newly outlawed activities, for example, hunting or logging, had their rights curtailed, while others not previously involved in those activities actually saw benefits from alternative income sources that were often brought with these types of projects, or they saw benefits from local infrastructure development. So in terms of environment and rights, we see even more trade-offs here, where only about 19% of cases did we see where both environmental condition improved and rights increased. We saw mostly trade-offs here, where the environment improved, rights being curtailed, right? So this one is more or less expected. Lots of case studies of community forestry speak of conservation being like the top priority for the intervention. So it's not surprising that resource access in those cases decrease and environmental conditions are improved as a result, right? Keeping people or cattle out of the forest, allowing for regeneration and increased environmental health. So if we look at it all together, how often do we get triple positive outcomes? Well, according to our data, very few times. So 18% of our cases saw positive outcomes across the three different types of outcomes. Positive here, of course, meaning increases. And what we see is that the income environment outcomes tend to be positive, and then you get to trade-offs between environments and rights. So to conclude this part of the study, what we found is that we do see trade-offs in outcomes where rights are most often compromised. And that, of course, can be explained by formalization of previously customary rights often means that forest users are left with fewer rights, or some users are left out of what ends up being the community, that community focus of the community forest project. Of course, what we do need to also point out is that in those cases where rights were not compromised, so this is 85 of our cases, forest condition and income were mostly maintained or enhanced. So 75% of those cases saw improvements or maintenance of forest condition, and 100% of them saw improvements or no changes in incomes. So we can't really say anything about cause and effect here. This is a finding that warrants further study using different research designs, so we can actually isolate the effect of resource rights. And so all this is just saying is, in implementing community forestry, we need to really carefully examine who in the local community is benefiting from formalizing collective rights, who is left out from the creation of new community-based institutions, and who is negatively affected by changes to individual rights. So part 2 of the study, and this I'll explore in less detail, was really trying to isolate these drivers of the joint outcomes. So can we identify the socioeconomic, institutional, biophysical conditions that lead to positive environment, income, and rights outcomes? And so just very broadly, and of course the details are in the paper, we found a couple of different characteristics of interventions that led to positive joint outcomes, a couple of biophysical characteristics, and this has been less of a focus in the literature, a couple of local institutional factors, and this has been more of a focus in the literature. Different user group characteristics are associated with better outcomes. And then also kind of new to the literature is that different national level characteristics were associated with different outcomes. So I just want to highlight a couple here: forest type and de facto management exclusion rights. These came out as associated with positive outcomes across all the different combinations of outcomes. And so that's something to keep in mind, that forest type seems to be an important predictor of how well a community forest project will do. And then communities that had de facto management and exclusion rights prior to the intervention were most likely to see joint positive outcomes or positive joint outcomes, different combinations. And in fact, de jure rights were less important as predictors in our models. So conclusion on this part is that many factors shape the likelihood of a CFM intervention achieving its goals, right? No group of factors will universally determine whether CFM will achieve its goals in any given context, right? So what we can do here, we don't have the universal answers, but what we can do is use these results to consider specific contextual factors in thinking through theories of change. So for example, here, we know that de facto rights seem to be important. So in setting up community forest, it's important to consider the nature of the rights practiced and not just the formalized rights, right? What's written in law. We know that forest type seems to be important, so let's think through how different forest types might affect potential productivity or profitability or opportunity costs, and just think through that process. So of course, a better understanding of context can help us better target support programs to overcome any unfavorable conditions. So one way to interpret these findings is that they point to contexts where communities might actually need more help, support in some ways to overcome disadvantageous conditions. For example, different biophysical conditions they can't really do much about. They might need support to overcome that particular barrier. And so this helps us to rethink how we implement CFM so that these interventions are adequately contextualized for existing local institutions and existing local conditions. Another important thing to think about is trade-offs can be unavoidable in some situations, but what's important to think through is which trade-offs are acceptable for the communities themselves and for other stakeholders, and then how can they be appropriately compensated. Thank you.